Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery Podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast. In this episode, I'm going to explain to you why you shouldn't be put off by properties that have got structural problems. I see a lot of amateur investors and, of course, private buyers that are running away from properties with structural problems. But what I'm here to say to you is I'd like to encourage you to run towards the properties with structural problems, because actually you'd be surprised how easy it is to repair some of the issues that are actually making a property completely unmortgageable. Now, the obvious things that you're going to see in these properties are going to be cracks. There's normally signs of movement, some cracks above the windows, cracks in the corner of the walls. You might find that if you're walking around on a floor inside, you find that it tips into the corner or tips towards the front wall or the back wall or something like that. And if you look outside, you'll perhaps see that there's been some displacement of brickwork. So they're the real obvious kind of structural problems. There can be some other slightly harder problems to see. The common one here is where the front or back walls have actually started bowing out slightly. If you can stand and look along the front wall, if you can find a point where you can look along the front wall, you can sometimes see that they're bowing out slightly. That can be caused by defective lintels and things like that. It can also be caused by some work that's been done to the roof that's actually made the roof much heavier, and as a result, the roof is actually just pushing down onto those external walls, often the front and back wall, but it just depends which way round the roof is actually pitched. And if you can go inside the roof space, you may be able to see some evidence of movement up there. You may be able to see that there's no internal support bracing the roof back down onto the main structure of the ceiling, effectively, of the floor below. And you don't need to be an expert about any of these things. This is the key thing. What the amateurs are thinking is that they need to know what the problem is. They need to know how to repair the problem. And what I'm here to say is you don't actually need to know. I've got over 30 years of experience in construction. I've worked on many properties that have had structural problems. And I don't claim to be an expert on structural problems at all. I'm not qualified to give advice on structural problems. The first thing is I know a man who is. But secondly, from experience, what I've seen and what I now know is that a lot of structural problems, whilst they may look quite severe, can actually be resolved at a relatively low cost. And I've certainly made properties that are unmortgageable, structurally sound and mortgageable for less than £5,000. So if I said to you, there's a property out there that is unmortgageable and for £5,000 you can make it mortgageable, would you be more interested? Now, I can't explain to you what that property is necessarily, because the defects in each individual property are actually different, and the rectification of those defects is different. And sometimes the repair of the structural problem is not actually that expensive, but the repair of the cause of the structural problem is a little bit more costly. So we've got to understand two things two things at the same time. Effectively, what has caused the problem, and then what is the repair to the problem, which could be putting something back to how it was, or it could be accepting that there has been some movement, and all we want to do now is stitch it all back together and ensure that it doesn't move anymore. Some of you might be thinking here about underpinning, and underpinning is one of those kind of scary words. It's not quite asbestos, but it's up there as a scary word in construction. And what's really interesting is a long time ago, 20 plus years ago, underpinning was the solution to everything. And I was involved in projects back in those days where there was structural movement, and we were underpinning buildings at an enormous cost, an enormous environmental cost as well, because we were filling the ground up with huge amounts of concrete and sometimes steel as well. And at the same time, to some extent, blighting properties because they had this stigma that they'd been underpinned. Now, in theory, if you buy a property that's been underpinned, it's less likely to fall down than anything else in the street. But there is this negative vibe about underpinning. And as a result, home buyers particularly weren't buying properties that had been underpinned. And so a lot of underpinning was carried out under insurance claims. And the insurance companies started working with structural engineers and other construction experts to see exactly what was needed and whether underpinning was the solution to everything. And by and large, where we've got to now, I'm not saying there is no underpinning, because there are definitely buildings that can't be saved any other way apart from underpinning. And we still use underpinning as a way to, if we're perhaps converting a basement and we need to drop the floor level. And of course, in central London, there's a number of basements created there, and that's all created with an underpinning type structure. But a lot of repairs to regular residential units now don't use underpinning. We do a lot more repairs by stitching together the brickwork and using stainless steel bars built into the brickwork. So we rake the brickwork out, the mortar beds get raked out. We put stainless steel bars in the brickwork across the cracks, and then we repoint it all. And that is not overly complicated, not overly costly, and the bill and of course the work is done in a matter of days. Whereas underpinning, we're talking weeks and sometimes even months, depending on the scale of the work needed there. We've also got other stainless steel and or steel bars that we can use to, for instance, pull the front of the building back into the structure, pull the back of the building into the structure. And structural engineers will use structural steel within the building to help tie external walls together in that situation. If we've got problems with the structure of the roof, we can normally just introduce some additional timbers to brace those timbers back. I did those on one of my properties only a few years ago. I don't think it cost £2,000 to solve the situation there. There was no real evidence from the outside that there was some structural movement. You could just see that within the roof things had settled a little bit. So we jumped on that before it became an issue, and it didn't cost us a great deal of money at all. If the walls have bowed excessively, you may need to rebuild those. But a lot of the time, we now accept that there's been some movement. We do the work to patch it up, as it were, to almost conceal it. And we accept that there are a few bits of twisted brickwork and twisted masonry. And of course, if you look at any old building, you'll always see brickwork and masonry and details that are a bit out of kilter. And it's really come back to this whole mindset that we do better repairing what we've got than rebuilding and creating massive work from some of these issues. So the key thing for you guys is that I said you didn't need to understand the problems. The key thing for you guys is you need to bring in someone who does understand the problems, and that's not me. I've got a good idea from experience, but I'm not qualified to give advice relating to structural repairs that are needed. What you need, or the person you need for that, is a structural engineer. And the structural engineer is going to look at this from two contexts. First of all, what has failed and what might have caused that failure. And then secondly, what do we actually need to do to rectify the problem? Now, sometimes the structural engineer can't always say what has caused the problem. For instance, if there's been some collapsed drains, the structural engineer might only be able to guess that the problem is some collapsed drains. For instance, there's two manholes and there's a wall somewhere between these two manholes, and there appears to have been some movement in the wall. Now, the structural engineer is not, he might lift up the manhole covers, but he's not got the facilities to see if that drain's collapsed. So you may at this point need to talk to a drainage engineer who's got the CCTV camera kit on the back of their truck, and they can put the CCTV camera kit down there to understand what the cause of the problem is. But structural engineers have got a reasonable amount of knowledge of most causes of structural movement, but sometimes they will need you to get someone else in to look at some of these other things. I've had to get tree surgeons and people like that in the past to deal with trees that have been causing problems, either taking too much moisture from the ground, or sometimes where trees have been taken down, and as a result, we've now got too much moisture in the ground, and we sometimes have had to take get some knowledge get some advice from some other people. But by and large, structural engineers will be able to work out what the cause is, and then come up with some remediation work for you. So the key thing here is that you need this information to be before you can even bid to buy the property, or unless you are going to bid to buy the property subject to a structural engineer's report, and following which whatever cost comes to light, you're going to adjust your offer price. So you can do a subject to kind of offer here. But important thing is you need this knowledge before you can firm up your offer price. And I'd encourage you to go back to podcast number 4 in this series where I was talking about how to ensure that you never overpay for a deal. And one of the things I was talking about there was having the knowledge before you actually bid for a property. So working backwards from the end value and knowing what it's going to cost to get to that end value. And what I'm talking about in this episode is one of those things that could well be a cost that you've got to factor in to the offer that you make to the vendor of this particular property. So use the structural engineers to give you some advice as to what might be the cause and how to repair it. Now, structural engineers will generally give you a budget price for the repair. So based on their expertise, they'll give you a basic specification, and they will give you a budget price for the repair. And they may even be able to give you a little bit of a steer towards resolving the cause. It just depends. They may say that you need to get someone else to actually have a look at it and get some more knowledge on that. And then, of course, if you do bring in someone, say, like a drainage engineer, and they put a CCTV camera down it, they will be able to ascertain what the problem is, and then they'll be able to give you a quote for rectifying the drains, digging them up, relining them, doing whatever is necessary. So we're getting this information so that we can actually make the right offer for the property in the first place. And something that is massively on your side as far as structural problems goes is that if there are perceived structural problems to a building, the likelihood is that the estate agent, particularly if you're seeing this through an estate agent, they will almost certainly say cash buyers only. If there is any knowledge that there is structural movement, and perhaps there's a historical report or something like that, then they will almost certainly say cash buyers only. Anything that says cash buyers only is very unlikely to be bought by a private buyer, so a home buyer. There are a few home buyers, of course, that will buy cash, but not so many. So now we've got rid of all of those people that are possibly going to bid too much, get a little bit overexcited, don't really care how much they spend because they're buying their dream home. They're all off because they can't get a mortgage. They don't know about things like bridging finance, and they don't know some of the other creative things. I'm going to talk about some of the creative ways shortly. And if they do know about bridging finance, they're probably going to be scared of it. They probably don't also know quite how to solve the problem. So they're just not going to hang around. So you've gone from a property that might have had quite a bit of interest to only having very limited interest now, perhaps only from some other property investors like yourself and some perhaps small builders that believe that they can repair the problem. And so what you've now got back on your side is time, because all of those parties will be doing the same research and building up their offers in the same way as you. That's not to say you can dither around. You need to be taking action and moving things forward. You need to clearly keep the estate agent abreast of what you're doing and what the process is and when you might be able to make an offer. But the important thing is we've got rid of all of those private buyers who are likely to be thinking about it over dinner tonight or over the weekend and making an offer reasonably quickly without really thinking about what that is, because they don't mind, by and large, as long as they're buying the house they want in the area they want, they'll deal with things. And some of these private buyers aren't even aware of structural problems. Some of them, they're not even looking at the structure when they go to the property. They're looking at it from, can I live here? Can I bring my family up here? Does this work for me? And of course, the inside of the property might be in reasonably good condition, but the cracks are likely to show on the outside. By the way, when you're viewing a property and you see cracks on the outside, well worth having a look on the inside. If they go right through the building, then that's more of a serious problem, which for you is good, because the more serious the problem, the less people there are in competition with you. And I've seen cracks on the outside of a building and gone inside, particularly upstairs, and I've gone into the bedroom where I think there might be a crack, and it's like, oh, the wardrobe's in a bit of a funny place, isn't it? And if I've been able to, I've looked behind the wardrobe and I've seen the other side of the crack. So vendors will move things to cover problems. Vendors will repaint part of their houses to cover over cracks on the inside, hoping you won't spot them. But most vendors can't do much on the outside. Some of them will hack off and re-render the whole of the outside, by the way, and cover up the structural movement. So you have got to be a bit of a detective. You've got to dig a little bit deep. And one of the really useful resources we can use now is Google Maps, because in Google Maps we can look at the property from the street view, and we can also go back in time. And there's now quite a reasonable amount of history on a lot of properties. And so you might see some structural cracks back 3-4 years ago that now are concealed by some brand new rendering. That's not to say the problem hasn't been cured. Maybe the problem was cured previously, but maybe you're still seeing some evidence on the inside and it looks like it's just been patched over from the outside. Maybe it's a DIY job. So you've got something, somewhere to start and something to look at and something to point an engineer towards. So the engineer becomes your friend here. And I think you be aware that there's kind of two levels of service you can ask here from a structural engineer. And a lot of consultants will be the same, actually, in whatever you approach them for from a consultancy perspective. And this includes me. First of all, engineers will pay a visit to the property and they will give you a visual inspection and they'll give you a verbal report, pretty much whilst you're standing there with them, walking them round. Now, that could be a good entry level. It's going to keep the price down. You may only pay £300, £400 for that, plus VAT, for someone coming out to see you and giving you a report, which might be, look, you've got a massive problem here. This is a massive can of worms. Don't proceed, or proceed with caution, or actually there's nothing here to worry about. You can just repair this. It's all cosmetic type. type stuff, or it looks like it's had a historical problem. The historical problem has been resolved. The building's not moving anymore. It actually just needs replastering and painting. So you might get that kind of report, a verbal report for £300-400 plus VAT. Make sure you use an engineer that's nice and local to the building. You don't want to be paying for an hour of travelling each way. That's just a waste of money. So look for an engineer that's reasonably local, can be there in 15-20 minutes, and then you shouldn't have to pay too much. Now, if the problem is greater, or you need a lot more information, maybe to demonstrate to lenders that you know what you're doing, or to be able to put together a schedule of work so the builder can repair it for you, then that visual inspection and verbal report will be turned into a written report. And that's pretty much going to double the price, maybe a little bit more. Normally, you can get structural engineers written reports for less than £1,000. So, what I'm saying here is, if you don't have to pay a lot of money to find this information out. You might pay a little bit to get started, and then a little bit more to get some clarity. But it does mean that you're not spending a huge amount straight away on something, of course, that at this stage you possibly haven't even purchased the property. So you probably don't want to be spending too much money at this stage. But just to reinforce, you will have to spend some money. So don't try and do this by guessing, and definitely don't try and do this by bringing in a builder, because builders are not experienced structural engineers per se. There's the occasional one that is, but per se they're not. So a builder is definitely not going to help you here. You need a structural engineer. Now, on that same basis, just a bit of advice to give you here is that the only people that can help you at this stage is a structural engineer. One of the mistakes I see a lot of property investors making is that they make an offer for the property, they get the offer accepted, they go to get finance. The lender then says, right, we're going to send a valuer to your property to verify the value. The valuer comes down to site, for which you've probably paid £1,000 or so. The valuer comes to site. You start walking. They start walking around. They see the structural cracks, and because they're not structural engineers, they put in their report that the property is worth nothing, or they say that they can't value the property until the extent of the structural repairs are actually known. So, and at that point, the next person you have to bring in is a structural engineer. By which point, the structural engineer might say, look, I'll tell you what, this building isn't salvageable, it needs putting down, which may not be what you want to do at all. It may well be that you were planning to refurbish the building and you're not interested in putting it down and starting it again. So my advice is always get the structural engineer in first. Get the clarity on the structure first before paying money for a valuation surveyor. Because if you've paid £1,000 for a valuation surveyor or more, and then you pay another £1,000 for a structural engineer, and the structural engineer gives you news that you don't want to hear, you've spent £2,000. Whereas if you get the structural engineer down there first and he gives you news you don't want to hear, you've only spent £1,000. So that would be my typical advice. And this again is where private home buyers get themselves a little bit mixed up. And again, there could be an angle for you here, because private home buyers see a property, they make an offer, they go to their mortgage lender to get a evaluation, and quite often they get a basic building survey. They get a building condition survey as part of their mortgage, and the surveyor that does that, they're a building surveyor, building/valuation surveyor most of the time, but more likely building surveyors will come to the property, they will do their survey, they will flag up that there's some structural problems, and a structural engineer is needed to advise on the defects. And at that point, a number of private home buyers actually say, structural problems, it's falling down, it needs underpinning, major problem, not interested, walk away onto something else. Now, that's the point where estate agents can and will say cash buyers only. So they'll change the details and say cash buyers only. No evidence that it is, it's just that some structural cracks have come to light, and the assumption by most people is that structural cracks actually mean that the property is unmortgageable. That's not the case. And of course, there are within commercial mortgages and commercial finance, there are products that you can use and work with to repair these properties. And this is clearly discussion for you to have with your broker at some point. So the other thing that I wanted to pick up here is that now we know that there are some problems. Now we know that we've got a vendor who wants to sell their property. There are problems. They can't sell it on the open market. It's unmortgageable. Most people now aren't interested. There's only you and the builder around the corner that are interested in it. This is where you, with hopefully some other knowledge you've got of property investing, may be able to use some other angles. You may be able to, for instance, negotiate an exchange with delayed completion. Now, for those of you that aren't aware how an EDC works, you'll know that when we buy a property, we get the contractual side to a point where we exchange contracts. Effectively, you sign a copy of the contract, the other party sign a copy of the contract, your solicitors exchange those over. And then that's kind of both parties say, yeah, we're going to proceed with this, but we normally have, quite often there's a 2-week window in there because we need to just get things sorted out. If someone's moving out of the property, they've obviously got to line up removal trucks. They've got to tie everything up and sort out other bits and pieces. So that is often 2 weeks, but it actually can be any period we agree. And one of those periods could be, say, 4 months. You could agree that between exchange and completion, there's a 4-month window. And you could agree that within that 4-month window, you are actually going to do the work. Because you've exchanged contracts, the commitment is there to see the contract all the way through to completion. But you could use this window to repair the property, and maybe even refurbish the whole property. And then you're now getting finance based on a building that is tip-top condition at a higher value. So could you negotiate a discount in the first place, an exchange with delayed completion, and therefore leave less money in, maybe get all of your money out? I've used exchange with delayed completion previously, not with structural problems, but with a block of flats where we made a very keen offer because no one was buying it, and the vendor, it was an empty flat. The vendor was the landlord that owned 3 flats in the block, so we bought all 3 flats. 2 were occupied, the third one wasn't. It was very poor condition, and we realised that we could refurbish that. It looked worse than it was. We only spent about £14,000 refurbishing this little flat, but as a result of doing that, the value of the building was considerably more. In fact, I think the value of the building was £25,000 more with that flat refurbished. So we got finance based on that. So that's an exchange with delayed completion, and you may well be able to use that to buy a property with some structural movement. You may well also be able to use an option contract, either a lease purchase option where you've got a tenant perhaps still paying you some rent, or you manage to agree a form of rent back with the owner, or you could just have an option subject to. So you could have an option subject to structural engineers and a structural engineers report. So other people teach these strategies far better than me. I kind of know the strategies, but I don't teach these strategies. But just be aware that other knowledge you've got within property can be used to help you drive better deals with the knowledge that I'm giving you as far as these structural problems. So the whole thing here is about going into these properties with our eyes wide open. We're looking for issues. We're finding these issues, hopefully, because finding these issues is good, because immediately you've got less competition and you've perhaps got a motivated seller who wants to get rid of their property, and now they found they can't sell it to the public because no one can get a mortgage on it, and this is all major trauma. You could perhaps be in there working with them helping them understand what needs doing. Um, and with this knowledge, you're now going to find that you're in a slightly different place. You've got less competition. The key thing is to understand what needs doing. And the only person that can tell you what needs doing is a structural engineer. And with that knowledge, you can then factor that cost into your offer price. So go carefully, but don't run away from these. There are genuine offers out there. There's genuine deals out there in property that have got structural problems. As soon as you see a property that has got structural problems, get the structural engineer in there. Don't procrastinate. Don't look at anything else. Don't try and factor too much more into this, because it's only with the structural engineer's advice can you actually decide whether this is even a property to proceed with. And I'm reminded of a lady I met a number of years ago. She told me that she'd seen two grand houses that she felt she could convert into some HMOs. She was a relatively new investor, so she wasn't really getting on with purchasing these properties. They were just a nice thing to see, and she kept driving past them, and she really wanted to buy them and convert them into HMOs. She hadn't done a lot of research into them, and then she rang me in a bit of a panic and said, could I meet her at these properties? They had gone into auction, and she now needed to make a decision and actually make a bid for these particular properties. So I met her at the property, and of course there was a fee for this. So she's now paying me a fee, and by now this has gone on probably for 5 months or so. So she's known about these properties for a long time. And we walked around the first property. I was very careful when I shut the doors because the building was full of cracks. I was really concerned that if we slammed the doors too much, the building was going to fall down. We didn't even go into the second property because it just felt like it needed pulling down. And that was my advice to her, was that actually there were some serious structural problems here. She needed to get a structural engineer to look at these structural problems. And he did just that, and of course paid a fee then for a structural engineer to look at the problems. Structural engineer pretty much agreed with me that the whole building needed pulling down. Excuse me. So she could have gone straight to the structural engineer and only paid one fee out. As it was, she engaged me first because she thought she needed a budget for these works, and the house was beyond salvage. The other obvious thing here was that these two houses were sitting on a fairly sizable bit of land on a fairly prominent road through the town. And I haven't been past since, but I'm pretty certain there'll be a block of flats sitting there now. There was plenty of space for getting off-road parking, and there was plenty of space for building possibly even as many as 8 flats. And I bet it got bought by a developer in the end. The key thing to learn from that is that this particular investor could have got the structural engineer involved very early on. These cracks were not hidden anywhere. She could have got the structural engineer to look at them very early on. Probably as a result, parked that opportunity, freed it from her mind, gone on and done some other things. And that's the key thing here. We want to be able to look at properties, make a decision, and move in one direction or the other. We want to move forward with the property that we've viewed, or we want to say, no, actually, it's not going to work for me. I'm not into the market of knocking down houses and building blocks of flats. That's not what I want to do. Therefore, this isn't the right purchase for me. So that's the reason for getting the structural engineer in there nice and early, because they really are going to be your friend in this situation. So go with your eyes wide open. Don't guess anything. Bring in a structural engineer nice and early, and actually make it your business to go and look for properties with structural problems, because you can invariably add way more value than the cost of, or you can add way more value than the cost of the repair. You can negotiate good purchase prices, particularly with residential homeowners who are paranoid that they've not now got a building that's going to fall down. And in most cases, the building isn't going to fall down. It does need some repair. And that's why you're going to get a structural engineer in to advise you. So the structural engineer is going to be your friend here, but I'm here to encourage you to look at more buildings with structural problems. All the best with that. And I look forward to catching up with you in another one of these episodes next week.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.